Okay, so we're going to begin. All right, so we're in a pandemic, and it's unprecedented for our generations, and we're close to, maybe an older generation back in 1918 when there was the Spanish flu that wiped out a significant portion of the population. But even the bubonic plague, when you look at pandemics of the past, how lucky, I'm going to just ask you to think about this. How lucky are we that we get to experience a pandemic at a time when we have the kind of science and the communication tools to be well informed in order to save lives? This COVID virus is incredibly contagious and lethal to the most vulnerable among us. And we value life that much. So in that sense, what we're dealing with, if we put it in perspective, is life interrupted, not life ended. And there are consequences to our choices, and these are the collective choices. We don't always get to have a say on what the public policy is. We probably have different ideas on how to solve this problem or respond. There's a difference between coping or predicaments and problems. Sometimes it's not a problem, it's just a predicament, we cope. So in many ways we're coping. But so we have life interrupted, and we have a whole bunch of consequences, which I've listed here on the screen. But and we're all experiencing them to one way or another: the separation, the quarantines, the loss of employment. Parents are feeling, and educators are feeling, an enormous burden of trying to maintain a sense of ongoing learning and sense of security for the children in our system. We are not having all the exact same experiences. I mean, at the core, we suffer the same. We're all impacted by this same decision to interrupt life, but we have our unique experiences. And so we're not always going to just want to buy into somebody else's emotion. And there's one more video, and I promise I won't keep doing this, but this is a really important one because I came across it last night as I was searching. Is there something that maybe we can all relate to in terms of the frustration that the teachers and the parents are feeling? Because many of you here are educators and parents. Many of you are parents that are trying to keep it all together in many different ways, not just with the academics, but financially, and you have aging parents and all of that. So listen to this. This is a video that I came across, and it was a rant that went viral a couple of weeks ago from a mom in Israel. So the caption's in English, so you can read it, which is good. But it speaks to the heart. When you listen to her voice, even if you don't understand her language, you can go, yeah, I get that, I'm there. And educators, this just highlights to me how much we depend on you to team and collaborate in terms of helping our children learn and grow. That we in that sense, we're in this together. But our frustration levels can make it feel like we're not. So listen to this. Get this going.
Joanna, don't forget to switch your viewing option. So we're looking at your internet.
How about that?
Thank you.
How that? Okay, thank you for your patience, everybody. I'm still learning too. I'm definitely not a digital native. So listen to this.
באמת, זה פשוט לא, זה בלתי אפשרי. זה לא נורמלי. מהבוקר, אנחנו רק ביום השני, מיליוני הודעות בוואטסאפ, יש לי 4 ילדים שיהיו בריאים, תדמיינו כמה וואטסאפים, כמה מורות לכל ילד, כמה מקצועות לכל ילד. יש לי רק 2 מחשבים בבית, הם רבים מהבוקר על המחשבים. אחד המורים של הבת שלי חי בסרט שהיא ב8 בבוקר תשב לראות אותו על המסך, היא ב8 בבוקר רק הופכת צד במיטה. מה נראה לכם? המורה למוזיקה של הבן הקטן שלי, היא שלחה תווים הבוקר. מה אני עושה עם המידע הזה? מה, יש לי הרכב של איזו להקה? אני לא יודעת לקרוא תווים. שנייה, אני מוציאה קלרינט, ויושבת עם הבן שלי לעזור לי לו עם התווים. די, חבר'ה, מורים, תניחו ציפיות, זה לא הגיוני. וכל היום, איך הילד מרגיש? איך שיצייר ציור? איך הילד מרגיש? הוא כל היום בפלאפון, טוב לו. ישנים טוב, אוכלים, לא מפסיקים לאכול. איך הוא מרגיש? שאלו אותי איך אני מרגישה. קורסת. אני עוברת מילד לילד. הנה מדעים, הנה מתמטיקה. הנה, חלס, גם איפה אני יודעת את כל הדברים האלה? עכשיו הילדים שלנו יעלו על עלינו כמה אנחנו סתומים. זה לא לעניין, באמת. אני יודעת להפוך שבר מתומה. גם אם הוא מתונה, אני רוצה להגיד משהו. למה צריך להתעסק איתו? הוא לא אמיתי, עזבו אותו בשקט. מה אני אומרת פה? גמרתם עלינו, זה רק היום השני. אם לא נמות מהקורונה, נמות מלמידה מרחוק. זהו, פרקתי. בבקשה, להוריד קצב, תניחו להם. שיהיה יום מהמם.
Is that working, Zelly? Are we back to the screen? Okay, so that to me, this woman, she is for what it's worth, she is actually a special ed educator herself, okay? She's feeling the stress. Everybody's feeling the stress, but what it tells me is that parents and teachers really are a partnership in making sure that our children feel well, and that the anxiety level from a parent perspective, and I know I hear it from the teacher's perspective, is like, are the kids okay? There's gaps. Not every child going home is in a home where it's going to be okay. And so there's that sometimes going on. But the parents in general are feeling overwhelmed often. And I think coming through this, we'll have a greater appreciation for each other, hopefully, because we'll learn and grow from it. So the main education goal today for me, and what I want to share with you is what is the learning? If we don't take a learning mindset, then it can be very difficult to rise above the adverse circumstances of this COVID-19 threat. And as I said earlier, the threat is less about death, thankfully, and more about how we're going to adapt and cope with the consequences of our own making in response to that threat, and create a mindset that really affirms that we are resilient. We may not like all of our choices, but there you go. That is our choice, to be resilient or not. And so the three areas that I'm going to go into, I'm going to walk you through some of the principles of thought leadership in a crisis situation, with some of the science that kind of informs us on what does that look like, and why thought leadership really does have a very real physiological and spiritual and social impact in the home, what that dynamic will look like with your children. And then the elements of family culture, which is really, I'm just going to walk you through it, and some of the main ones that, and really discuss it from the standpoint of understanding that these are the things that we have control over. It's software for the heart and mind. It builds trust and fosters resilience, and it starts with you. And then I have a series of enrichment activities, which I'll just walk you through, and then you can explore them later when you get your slides. So Zelly, let me know as long as everything is okay, people can see. I'm still on the PowerPoint, so I don't have any more videos.
Yes, everything looks great. And just to say to everybody, just to make a note, if you're not viewing the entire slide, you can hover over the center top of the screen where it says view options, and you can select a different side so that you can see the entire slide.
Thank you. All right, so we're living, in a state of high anxiety, and I think to some extent with the devices and the internet, it already was, relatively high, but now we're going into overdrive. And that feeling of overwhelm that you heard the special ed educator express, just kind of vent. I think we're all feeling in some areas of our lives, depending on the school district and your family situation and your child's academic needs, that may not or may not be your stressor, but you could hear in her voice the overwhelm. And that's where we feel the emotion the same. We may have different circumstances. We may have a different blend of what the environment looks like, but that feeling of powerlessness is what we're trying to contend with. So my friend Zelly, she is a great illustrator and a great teacher. She's a toxicologist and really studied the brain and stress and the body's stress response. And I just wanted to share some of the science behind the things that we do actually have control over, and we'll go into it a little more depth, but just from just a primer standpoint, and I'm not an expert in this, but as a lay person and how I've used it in my curriculum and my work with families, is to simply understand it this way. In the brain, it's like, the way I look at it is it's like learning how to drive a stick shift. You have the clutch and you have the gas, and you want to balance it right so that you can follow, go ahead and at a decent speed, follow the traffic. You have control over how fast you're going, and where you're going, and whether or not you're following the traffic laws and keeping track of the passengers in the car and all of that. So it's like that. So what we have is an anxiety response, which is something we don't control over in the brain. It's the lower part, I'll call it lower part. And again, I'm just a lay person, but it's the default. And by default, I mean, you don't control that. It happens to you. And so when that happens to you and you don't have the gas and the clutch working together to steady it, you can wind up going into a powerless state, which is away from empowerment. It's powerlessness. And then your fight is to have control over things that you don't have control over, because you're not thinking clearly about where your power is. So anxiety, the way we're wired, is supposed to help us get that motive. It sends out, it emits neurotransmitters. It's motive, it's energy to move, to do something, to respond to a situation or a potential threat. And when the prefrontal cortex, this is the part that's not default, this is the part that is learned through life experience. And over the years, we learn more and more about situations that are truly threatening and not so threatening. And so then we start to balance that out, and we can think more clearly and carefully about how we want to assess a threat, and then decide how to respond to a threat. And that is moving towards a stasis of empowerment. So that's how I look at issues of control and empowerment. When we are taking responsibility for thinking about what the body is telling us, then we can have more control over ourselves, not over what's happening in the world. And that's what we're aiming for. Now, this is one of my most favorite slides, because this is me. I can speak to this. This is the default mode of a parent who worries, tends to, punish for discipline, and offers her own opinion as the only understanding in the room. And when I started my parenthood journey, this was definitely me. I consider myself to be, fairly well educated, and knowing enough about life to, I had my first child at 24. And I thought I knew everything I needed to know, and my kids would just, my kids have schooled me, and so has life. And so this is what I call malware for the parent heart and mind. And this is based on lived experience, my studies, working with people, and also doing prevention strategy for substance use disorder with youth. So think of worrying as the opposite of love, of caring, because it's negative goal setting. And it emits a signal that can be perceived as hostile. When our children think that they're going to cause us worry, their worry is going to be, they're going to overreact. So they're going to be less comfortable coming to you with things that are not pleasant or that might cause alarm. And that's when we need them to come and speak to us, so that we can help them think more clearly about how to respond to the emotion and to the situation. So it's not the same thing as caring, but we can deceive ourselves into thinking that it is. And with punishment and discipline, consequences, when you set consequences ahead of time, they can be punishing, but they're known ahead of time. And discipline, and so when you enforce a consequence with anger in your heart, with frustration because you're worried, or because you have an opinion about what happened, and you're very you know, you wind up just feeling very disappointed or judgy about what's happening to your child, or what their behavior was. The message the child gets, and that we're talking head to heart, heart to head, because first they're going to feel it and then they're going to think it. And you have the responsibility to think it so that you can feel it and send it with the right signal. And it's going to be fear or love. So when you are angry and you're enforcing a consequence, the message the child hears is, I'm not okay, I'm outcast. And they tune out, they go offline, they can't hear your message. There's no correction. What they learn is that the crime was to get caught. I know this because I've studied it in drug use disorders. Discipline is teaching your child how to learn how to be responsible for their own thoughts and actions in every situation, no matter what, and to come home and seek wise counsel. You want them coming to you with their issues and talking about it, and not trying to figure it out on their own because they're afraid of disappointing you and being outcast. And I'm telling you, I don't care what kind of a good parent you are, whether you're permissive, whether you're authoritarian, whatever it is, the kids will oftentimes perceive that they are being judged. So it's very, very important that you are mindful of whether or not you're carrying that message. And then your opinion is not the same as wisdom. And this is my favorite one, because I am 60 years old and I love my opinion. I've been working on it for a long time. I think it's really, really good. There are times when I really want my opinion to be the only understanding in the room, but I understand that it is limited human understanding at any point in time. And until I hear about, it's limited understanding about a person or a situation at any point in time. And until I hear it from my child about what's happening and what they're thinking, I cannot know everything that there is to know about a situation that they're dealing with and that we're dealing with. I need to have their input. And that's the difference, because wisdom opens the mind. Wisdom thoughts open your mind. They settle you. It's going back to that diagram of Zelli's brain, right? So you've got the lower part of the brain, that's the default, that's the sympathetic nervous system, and that can be hyper vigilant with our opinions are very strong, and like we have judgment there, and there's a little bit of fear, and we want to avoid something, so we're just going to insist on our opinion because we think we know what's going to happen, what's best. Whereas the parasympathetic part of the brain, that's associated with the prefrontal cortex, that allows you to slow down, to calm down, to think through and open your mind and allow input, so that the pool of meaning in talking about what's happening in the moment can broaden, so everybody can have an input, and it's safe to have a perspective or an opinion and to not feel outcast. And that's when the real collaboration happens, when the real creative problem solving happens. And so when we worry and we punish and we insist on our own opinion as the only understanding in the room, that's when it can feel to the child that it's hopeless. My parents don't have confidence in me. And certainly I don't think they would articulate it this way, but in their heart, they realize that you're not confident. Now, compounding this. So this is, on the one hand, you've got the parent with, and this is extreme. I'm just sharing with you these concepts so that you can wrap your own mind around, does this apply to me? How does this apply to me? Because we're all human. But the children already had amped up anxieties about their value, about creating a sense of community and belonging when there was a lot of bullying anyway, and all of the emotions that we experienced in our peer experiences are on steroids. What do I want to say? It's not peer abuse. It's not just bullying, but it's learning how to make a community with your peers. Has always been a struggle in the adolescence, and there's all kinds of science and literature about and Hurt 2.0. If anybody wants to know more about that, I can send you that information. Goes in to describe the biology of it all. The kids today, for a lot of different reasons, they're starting adolescence much earlier. And I'm going to say psychologically, they're behaving and feeling like teens much earlier. They have more worldly information at their fingertips, and also their peers do. So even if they don't have it online, they're getting it. And so add the pandemic grief and loss of, you know, and the concerns of, am I going to have, are my grades going to suffer? You know, we already talked about the class of 2020, but you know, being separated from peers, not knowing, you know, what the rest of the school year is going to be like, what is next year going to be like. Some of the schools may be considering, you know, whether or not to advance kids, and, you know, there's just a lot of questions and answers, and that uncertainty is just another brick in their you know, emotional backpack that they've been carrying already. And if we're not mindful of that, what we do need to recognize is that your child is in charge of himself or herself, and whatever they choose to believe about who you are as a resource. And it's not always fair, because I will say that a lot of times what I've heard from kids, oh, my parents don't care about my grades, my parents this, my parents that. Well, they never tested that theory. They just assumed it because they already we're hardest on ourselves. Our kids are hard on themselves. So they tend to judge inwardly anyway. And so there's a vulnerability there where if we're all in a state of overwhelm, for a child to go quiet or act out, but either is an extreme. And so the importance of open dialogue in the home now, which is what the core curriculum of Fresh Start, the core connectivity core curriculum emphasizes, it's so, so important. So now I want to share with you this particular slide is like a snapshot of how I understand the human condition, that is vulnerable, and it's also resilient. And one of the things that happened when I left a career in technology back in 2004, 2005, to understand what does it mean to grow up with this device in the hand, the first thing that jumped out at me was that the network culture, the drug culture, and the parenting culture created a perfect storm for addiction. And at that time, we didn't know much about how addictive these devices could be. We really didn't, as parents, and I as a parent, didn't really even understand the human condition as it is exemplified in addiction treatment and recovery, and the hope of recovery. And so I got very interested and studied with all of the experts that, mostly local, that work in mental health and addiction treatment and work in the recovery coaching process, in order to inform my work as a prevention strategist in the field in Placer County with an organization, a coalition that's now called Raising Placer. And so we have, when we inform ourselves about the human condition for prevention as being hopeful, that it is, the human condition is prone to error. And so I look at, that's why, you know, addiction happens. It doesn't happen to everybody. Like I said, the pandemic response is going to be unique to each person and each family. We got to work it ourselves. But it's similar to how addiction happens. The brain is malleable. The neuroplasticity science of the brain tells us that it responds to everything. And one of my favorite teachers on the mind and the brain is Stephen Campbell, and he wrote a book called Making Your Mind Magnificent. I think it's how to mentor your brain. So, but he explains that the brain believes everything it sees, and it doesn't judge it, right? So it's like, if you can imagine your brain is like a video recorder, it's taking in, it's everything tactile, everything it sees, everything it hears, everything. It records everything. It's a recorder. That's the memory. And addiction basically is the brain responding to things that will tap that feel-good reward system in the brain, the short-term feel-good reward system. It doesn't matter if it's a drug, it could be food, it could be a toxic relationship of some kind where there's an unhealthy attachment to a person, where there's obsession, where your brain is kicking in and saying that worldly thing, that thing in the exterior out here is more important than what than me and my relationship with people, with other people. And so it becomes obsessive. And John Daly, who is a local addiction expert who passed a couple of years ago, came up with this revolutionary concept that addiction is, in his study of the brain too, that addiction is a pathological relationship to intoxication, which makes sense. So then it made sense why devices are so addictive, because the devices are designed on purpose by commercial interests to tap. They've studied how the brain responds to drugs and other things. And so they're designed to tap that feel good, short-term hit that the reward system of the brain gives you. And it's not fulfilling. And because it's not fulfilling, and not everybody has this happen, but it can happen where the brain then just hijacks and you go offline. And so your prefrontal, going towards empowerment, stops working. And now the brain it's like you're on this autopilot, in that more like that default mode. Now the resilience part happens, and this is the best part. The resilience part happens when a person inherently learns to rely upon their own powers of self-determination and chooses to reprioritize worldly things around healthy relationships with self and others. And that's what treatment is about. You detox first, but you cannot you can detox and detox, but until you are in a situation where that person is willing to engage. So this involves free will. That's why patience is so important, and perseverance is so important, and hope is so important, that we don't give up on people no matter what. And so in that sense, the mind, and Dr. Catherine Leaf, and when I do the follow-up email, I'll send you the video. She's got a beautiful video that explains, and this is my language, I just kind of, the best way to sum it up is that because of the way the brain functions, it responds to external stimuli, but it responds to internal stimuli. What is that? What is the internal stimuli? Thoughts that you choose in your mind to focus on. It is how we grow from trauma. We grow stronger. There's all kinds of post-trauma growth science on that topic. And we know this to be true from experience and from all the documentation as well. So in that sense, I look at thoughts as having somatic properties. They can, depending on who you are and your life experience, they can evoke an anxiety default response, or they can bring about peace and invite the parasympathetic, the higher power, to come in and do that adjustment, the clutch and the gas, and giving you control over the wheel, and your brain's not just reacting. So you go from a reactive mode to a more proactive mode, which is towards empowerment. In the other mode, you don't have control. So with that backdrop, then, this is how I view resilience. It's connected to thoughts. Going back to when I was saying about the default mode that parents go into, and we're all vulnerable to it, because that's the part we don't control. We all have our buttons. We want to be conscious about putting our opinions aside. We can have our opinions, and we can offer our opinions to our children, and we can talk about that, but what they need right now is wisdom. So let's talk about what that looks like. They are eternal thoughts that bring about peace. They empower self and others, and they transcend religious dogma. That is such an important part of it, because faith has become such a touchy subject. And it's very important that we examine ourselves and understand, where is your faith? What do you believe in your humanity and in your relationship with your child? And I think that for me, what I have found in all of my work and all of my field work and all of my work with families and my own family and my own sons, is that when I go to my wisdom thoughts, when I go to those core ones that you can find in Buddha and Confucius and what Jesus said, and as long as they are eternal, they bring about peace, they empower self and others, and transcend religious dogma, they hit a home run, head to heart, heart to head. In any circumstance, this is what's going to help lift you up and start problem solving in that prefrontal mode together. And you're living in a state of empowerment. So here's an example. What does that look like? I hope you can see the writing. I probably need to make it darker, so my apologies, but let me just read it. Here's an example. So love casts out fear. I mean, everybody agrees. I think we all can agree that's the eternal truth. Fear and love are opposites. But what does that mean? So in the context of a pandemic, okay, perhaps it reads something like this. To yourself, again, this is you preparing yourself to be resilient so that you can communicate more effectively. My anxious feelings are not the facts unless I choose to agree with them. Now that is a statement that I have used with my younger son who had a panic disorder, who was my digital native, who was way ahead of me on all of this stuff back in 2004, 2005. He bought his own pay-as-you-go Nextel, clunky phone device. And before I knew it, something called texting happened. And then next thing you know, there's the smartphone. So let me tell you, there was a big reason why I stepped out of my corporate treadmill to get in here. But that thought, my anxious feelings are not the facts unless I choose to agree with them. I'm going to tell you, every single time he had an episode of panic, we would talk about that and he would calm down. Because the underlying truth about that is that the wisdom thought, which comes from love that's in us, conquers fear in that moment. Not forever. He's going to have another bout, right? He's perfectly fine today, by the way. He's married and doing great, but it was a long process of figuring out how to make that work. And a big part of it was keeping the dialogue open about what was not only going out here, mostly it was what's going on in here. To be able to share that is sacred. Here's another example. I am a lifelong executive learner, always learning how to become a better version of myself. Now that under the wisdom thought underneath that statement is I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, and I do and I understand. And that's Confucius. That's an eternal truth. The question that we as parents have to ask ourselves, and I'm going to be honest, when I started this journey, I didn't believe it was true for my kids. I was struggling with my own desire to be in control of their choices because this thing was a game changer and I was mad. So you're talking to a reformed mom, by the way. This statement applies to an infant. I just got word this morning that my 3-month-old baby son came home from the hospital. He wound up the other night, dropped temperature, stopped breathing, and for 2 nights he was monitored, and they've decided he's okay. It might have been like a SIDS type thing, we don't know. But I'm telling you, I believe that my infant son, my infant grandson, is a lifelong executive learner. And he's always learning how to become a better version of himself. And my prayers for him was that he would learn, his immune system would learn, he would learn from this episode how to be stronger. And he's coming home today. But that's the thought that I communicate to my son and my daughter-in-law and her mom. And that's the thought we all agree with. that carried the day for the last 72 hours, wondering, is he going to be okay? In every circumstance or situation, this is another example. In every circumstance or situation, I have the power to choose what to think and how to respond, even if I do not like my choices. Now there's proverb underneath that, as a man thinketh, so is he. So there's power of self-determination. And so the way I look at it is the equation for empowerment is simply this: there will be consequences because we are powerful, creative, spiritual beings on this planet having a human experience, and we're learning together now globally. You know, China doesn't know transparency yet. They're going to learn it. Consequences plus love equals empowerment. So I want to, at this point, I'm going to invite you, if you would, to just, and my friend Zelly walked me through this a little bit earlier, because there's been a lot going on in our family and preparing for this and new technology for me. But I'd like to just do a breathing exercise, and then I want to take you through a couple of thought exercises for just a couple of minutes. So I'm going to ask you to just take in a deep breath for maybe, what was it, Zelly, can you lead them in a couple of rounds?
Yes, so the idea is that we're going to try to tap onto the vagus nerve that activates our parasympathetic, our relaxation and empower mode. And the simple way to do that is to double our exhalations. So just make yourself comfortable and take a couple of breaths, breathing in for 2, breathe out for 4. Inhale for 2 and exhale for 4. Now see if you can make your inhalations and exhalations a little bit longer. So let's breathe in for 3. Breathe out for 6. Breathe in for 3. Breathe out for 6. See if you can do breathe in for 4. Breathe out for 8.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I want you to just, hopefully you're in a more relaxed state and you can just think about this thought, because it always just makes my heart smile. Just think about each child that you have in your care, in your home. And then for each child, say this thought: my child is magnificent. Because our children are truly magnificent blessings. They have much to teach us as we have to teach them. And so when we are in the middle of a crisis or facing adversity with them, in order to be available and accessible to them as a trusted resource, one of the things that you can do is focus on the fact that no matter how much they may be driving you nuts, or how ungrateful they are, or how perfect they are, whatever state they're in, to just accept where they're at and meet them where they're at. And to be able to do that, I encourage you, not right now because we don't have time to go, this is not really a workshop, but to think about writing down your fear. If there's an incident that happened or just the whole situation, write down what your fears are. And next to each fear, write what the outcome is that's making you frightened. You know, that's something you don't want. When we fear something, it's what we don't want. We try to avoid. And then write down the opposite thought, because that's where your hope is. And you get to decide, okay, am I going to agree with that affliction, that behavior, that circumstance? Am I going to agree with that thought that's coming into my head about that? Or am I going to choose a different thought and figure out a way to rise above it and work through it differently in a more empowered state? It's your state of heart and mind that matters most right now. And that's the only thing that we really have control over. So we want to be able to communicate with our kids with a more hopeful perspective. So I'm going to move on now to the elements of family culture. And this is something in the resources guide that I'll walk you through later. It's taught in a manual called Fresh Start. It's a family culture builder for household executives, which it'll make sense to you in a minute. And this is like the software for the heart and mind. What I like to help parents understand is, you know, there's so much in the world that we don't have control over. But what you do have control over is your own state of heart and mind and the family culture. And you can engage kids in this. In fact, the more you engage them, the better. But that is what is you do have responsibility and control over that, over setting up these elements of family culture. And today, it's sort of like software for the heart and mind. It's like programming, if you will, right? So again, going back and where you can meet kids in the mind and have open conversations about what's happening. You want to set up the tools in your culture where in the head and the heart you live, so that it's possible to have more open dialogue. I'm sorry, let me go back one more time. So I had highlighted there beliefs and worldview, and then house rules and rites of passage. We don't have time to go into rites of passage, but in the book, which you can see later, you can read all about this. And if you want to delve deeper into it, there's 7 lessons, and I'll walk you through that later. It's just a highlight. But what we're going to focus on is the beliefs and worldview and the house rules. So from a worldview standpoint, when I started to look at my own sense of indignation that, oh my gosh, how could this land in the hands of kids? Like I said, my youngest bought his with his own paper route money, and I thought walkie-talkie, and the next thing I know, there's texting and social media and all that. It just came in like a tsunami. And so in my early years of researching this, I studied, okay, what are the power bases? What are the attachment styles? What are the discipline styles? Well, this is kind of how the pattern formed up for me, is that there's models of authority that sort of line up. And without going into too much detail, because we don't have a lot of time, number 2, I feel this is what I recommend, and this is really what informs the instruction in the Fresh Start manual, is the number 2, because it basically is really good for instilling discipline in the ways that we talked about earlier, where there's a less reliance on punishing or even just having nothing, right? It's the good balance where you can have pro-social, positive discipline, firm and kind, where the kids get a sense of a boundary but not feeling outcast. So that part is fine, but it doesn't help us deal with the deeper soul-based issues that we're all struggling with right now, those deep fears that are being ignited by what's happening in the pandemic. So I had, and this is all stuff that I had learned to help people deal with their anxiety over this. Applies to anxiety in general. So what I did was I studied how pedophiles and commercial interests engaged youth so that they could exploit them. And I put together a model of authority that I call the relational model of authority. So you had the authoritative. I'm introducing a relational model, which includes a social profile, which I'll call the digital native. These are kids that are born after 1990 and cannot imagine the world without the internet. And this is the profile. And this is, a lot of it came from talking with FBI agents early on about how kids get hooked, but also from the research on how commercial interests were going to be marketing to our kids, because that was the biggest market, right? And so I really wanted to know what were the corporations going to do so that I could then show parents how they were going to be targeting our kids. They had tons of resource for this information. So these are I'll call this list here are the touch points. And this is how you can connect. So when you understand that tech-savvy youth, they perceive authority as a relational experience. It's how they feel loved. The top-down command, you know, the hierarchies that many non-digital generations grew up with, that authority, that formal authority has less gravitas. It's important, and there's a whole nother training I do on connection and correction, and the authority figure is important. But for connection here, when we're talking about finding a way to regulate emotion in the home during a pandemic, this is super, super important to understand. That means that they want to be able to share openly without judgment. That's how they feel loved. They don't get it from their peers, really, but they certainly will recognize it when they get it at home. And so the other thing is their friend communities, they're cyber powered, and they're they can become a single point of reference for life. We want to avoid that, obviously, but my point about that is that we cannot judge it. Less so now, but 5-10 years ago, I had a lot of parents that just wanted to say, I'm going to forbid this. And that's really not a very reasonable approach. We can get into that discussion in another time, but the fact is you don't want it to become a single point of reference for life. You want to open up dialogue so the kids are coming to you with, hey, this is what's going on. That's what you want, not to forbid. And then you can impart wisdom, and we'll show you what that looks like. Texting and social media are a main artery of communication. They use the devices like, a pair of shoes. And I'm always amazed. And my millennials, my son and his wife, they're so agile with the technology. They just jump up and quickly learn things. So I'm just like, my motto for me right now, coming on this new age, the post-pandemic age, is I want to think like a digital native, because I've had to very quickly figure out how to make this Zoom thing work for a presentation that I would normally do in person. And it's exciting, because the kids know so much, and you can bond learning to use it with them. They're seeking authenticity, which means that you have to be vulnerable. You have to admit when you're acting out of fears. And Zelly has shared with me this concept of hijack. When you get hijacked, that means that your emotions have taken over. And so you come off as not relatable. And so you can say, hey, look, I want a do-over. Another friend of mine said, they do do-overs. And so sometimes it's important to admit when you lost it and say, let's try that again. I lost my temper, and we can do better. And ask your kids to give, and then most likely they'll want that. And then they'll want that from you as well. We want to be able to say, I'm going to hit the reset button. That really wasn't who I am. That was my reaction. Attention is the scarcity. And so, there is a war for our attention. These devices are definitely designed to be compulsive. Not everybody suffers it the same way, but that is the nature of it for commercial reasons. And then trust is the currency. And the difference, and later I'll show you in the book, there's some key concepts, and to have open, crucial conversations with kids. And there may be more moments now. Maybe there's too much chaos, but maybe you can find moments to have crucial conversations. But one of them is the difference between trust and faith. So trust among people, that what kids need to understand, is always, always verifiable, always. Because why? We'll go back to that human condition 101 slide. Because humans are prone to error. So we inspect what we expect. That means I'm expecting you to be acting your age, to having age-appropriate issues online and offline. So I will be checking the devices. I will be checking with you. I will be getting into your business, not so that I can micromanage you, but so that I can teach you how not to give up your power to the bully, the drug, or the device, or the pandemic. So that's the profile. So that's how you can engage kids to get their attention. Now, the other aspect of this relational model of authority is the fact that, and the best way I can put this, and this really took me a while to wrap my mind around it. So some of you may go, wow, she's really a slow learner. But that my child, you know, when I was going through this particular, the crisis with the mobile device landing in the hands of youth, I really questioned whether or not they had everything they need to overcome the consequences of having it. And in my case, the horses were out of the barn well before I knew to check things. I mean, I didn't, and another time I can tell you all of my regrets, you know, the confessions of an ancient cyber mom. Look at my hair, it's gray. But the reality is that our children are fellow human beings having a human experience. They are equal to us in this one very special way. They may be different gender, they have different personalities, they may even have different views on God, religion, world affairs, friends, all of that. But where they're the same is that they have the same powers of determination as an adult. They're equal powers of memory, intellect, and will. And this is a concept that's was hard for me. And so you decide how this applies to you, but you know, their prefrontal cortex was not fully developed. So how could they, you know? But the reality is, when you're connecting with your kids through that wisdom language that I'm talking about, where you prepare yourself and you say, you know, your higher power, God, Lord, you know, however you talk to your higher power, give me the grace to open my mind and stop judging and trying to micromanage what's happening, especially when it's disturbing my peace, so that my child can have a chance to have an experience, so I can fill their memory with having contributed to a pool of meaning, informing me about how their life and experience is informing them with fear or love or joy, whatever state of emotion they're in. Can you be trusted to just witness it? This is not conventional parenting. And so think of the memory as, like I said earlier, the brain recording everything. It takes it all in and stores it. And then the intellect is the executive capacity internally. It's the spiritual mind in the mind to discern and think about what's true about what you've been recording, what your experiences are. And the will is to decide what to think about it. And so discerning, you know, is this true or not? And then the will deciding to agree. So there's these three aspects of self-determination that come together. And that's how we form our worldviews. And they're unique to each one of us because we're each called to do it for ourselves. Even if a child chooses to embrace your worldview, which I'm going to show you what that looks like, in the family, they're still going to have a more personal, intimate version that they will work up on their own. And the more dialogue you have, the deeper and richer your relationship with the child. But going back to Dr. Catherine Leaf's statement, studies and her findings, that when you think, you build something of true substance. And so we really want to get ourselves and our kids in that prefrontal mode where we're actually more in a state of empowered thinking than the default mode of feeling helpless and hopeless. And so the core thought that I encourage people to anchor their beliefs around as a family is the same wisdom thought that makes a free society possible. You already have power to be free in your own heart and mind. It already belongs to your soul and it can never be taken, but it's easily surrendered to the bully, the drug, or the device. It's what made a free society possible. This country was founded by a handful of people that believe that one creator over all humanity grants everybody, no matter what their gender, what their creed, what their age even. If you think about all that we've learned, all the science since then informs us this way, that we are all first equal human beings having a human experience at different stages of life in different contexts. So at our core, we are the same in that way, that we have the choice to decide what kind of a worldview we want to create in this moment. Is it going to be one that empowers us, or one that makes us feel powerless? So this is an example in that sense, that when I looked at that, then when I showed you that slide of the elements of family culture, the very top one, which is the baseline, is beliefs and values. And so in this simple example of family creed, and in the book, there's a more elaborate one, but it's all based on this concept of freedom and accountability, individual accountability. So every person has already that power. And sometimes it gets hijacked, but collectively we can help overcome hijacked situations if we're all aware that we actually have that power. And every person then is responsible for their own happiness. And I think for a lot of children, they're worried about how parents are going to feel. They want to make them happy. And then the question becomes, in your life choices and in how you're handling your life situations, are you living for yourself? Are you learning how to be the person that you need to become? Or are you simply doing only what's going to please mom and dad? And so we'll get into what that looks like, because mom and dad should want them to learn how to become a trustworthy person. And whatever other choices outside of that belong to the child. And when we anchor ourselves around that, the children will feel more freedom to be more creative in solving problems and jumping in and contributing to the pool of meaning in life. So I wanted to just talk a quick minute about imparting wisdom, because it is a lot like downloading an app. So there are a lot of situations that come up, and I've had so many parents say, it's TMI, too much information, because like kids want to share. They just need to know that they're not going to be judged. Well, how do we, process that? How do we create an environment? So the way I look at downloading wisdom or imparting wisdom, it's like downloading an app. And what we know about apps and viruses online is that the only way they get in to our systems, our operating systems, and think of your heart and mind as an operating system, is if we give it permission. That's a very powerful thought. Again, you already have power. So if you give permission, then it's going to be in there. So then what happens? Well, we have behavior issues, but it can also be corrected and quarantined. So when you have a situation that you want to address, let's say emotions are high in the home and there's bickering and somebody got into a fight, or somebody's really feeling very angry, then you can sit down with them and ask them what is happening or has happened. And I use this also for dealing with kids that have been bullied for, sharing naked photos. This is to deal with kids, really extreme situations as well. It's the same process where you are calm, you sit down and you open your mind and you say, okay, I am going to learn something not only about my humanity, but I'm going to learn something about who my kid is in this situation, and allow my child to inform me. So you ask them what's happened or has happened, and you listen without anticipating your response. And that can be a tall order because we do have often emotion with it. But they are actually first, in my mind, this is how it worked for me. They are first a fellow human being having a human experience at that age, at their age in this time. When you see it that way, the head to heart, heart to head connection ignited, because you're thinking, they can feel your compassion. And I'm going to say most kids don't get a lot of that in their peer communities. And a lot of times in the home, we don't realize that it's not there. But this is a time where we can take charge and say, nope, we're going to make that a priority. I don't care how stressed I am, because there's a lot of healing in that. Then you repeat what you heard your child say without editorializing or clarifying, you know, but so that you don't edit it, and that's always been my temptation. I have to tell you, my sons, they've trained me well. When they felt like I was, you know, over starting to, you know, get hijacked, they would say, "Mom, too many words," and that was their polite way of saying, "Please be quiet, enough said." And that would be my signal to maybe come back at it another time more calm, because they could tell I was escalating. So you repeat what you heard your child say without editing it, and just let them clarify. You know, because this is the getting got part. This is where connection happens, and it's the opposite of feeling outcast. Because then you can just sit there in the moment and just let them have a moment. What I've found, and I found this to be true for myself and other families, is that when you can witness someone in their deepest, darkest, painful moment, and just witness and say, "Wow, I feel that too." There's something about that that's very empowering, where all of a sudden, with that witnessing and a trusted resource, that they don't feel like that situation and that feeling now, they can let it go because somebody witnessed it. There's a lot of power in that. And it's counterintuitive for the models of parenting that we inherited, where the seat of authority was pretty much in the parent. But here we're saying, you're in charge of yourself. I know you have powers of self-determination. We'll get to house rules. I'm not saying you don't have rules, but this connection is so important, especially in a time of crisis. And then you ask your child if they would like to know what you know about their situation or what happened to them. And the chances are that they'll be curious. And so downloading an app, it's like, would you like to know what's on my heart for you? I have something that may be helpful. And when they say, yes, please tell me, that's permissioning. That is them exercising their will, saying, I'm opening my mind to hear what you have to say that might be constructive for me. And when you offer that input, it's not to control them. It's to give them something to consider. So, for example, when I called my son in, he was maybe 16, my younger son. I called him in from being out and about, and it wasn't curfew, but I called him in because I got a heads up that something was going on. I can't remember exactly what, but I just knew it wasn't for him. So I said, "Come on home." And he was pretty angry. He'd come home, he stomped up the stairs and slammed the door and all that. And so I went upstairs and I knocked on the door and I said, I understand what I did made you feel small. And he wouldn't look at me, but when I said made you feel small, our eyes locked, because all of a sudden he realized that I knew how he felt. And I said, that was not my intent. However, I'm going to ask you to consider forgiving me, because I did not mean to make you feel that way. I am glad that you came home. I thank you for honoring my request. As the parent, this is where you belong. I know this is where you belong. And so I'm just going to ask you to think about forgiving me, because I think you know that I would never try to make you feel small. And then I closed the door. And here's the important thing. I never ever went back to him and said, "Did you forgive me?" Did I want to? Yes. Do I want to be in a relationship where I'm in harmony with my kids? Yes. Do I want them to be angry at me for being the parent? No. But sometimes, regardless of how they feel, we still have to move forward and let them know that their power is to choose not to hold it against me. And that's another way of correcting, because then you're both experiencing a moment where each can forgive the other. I forgave him for coming home and stomping up the stairs and slamming the door. There's usually a two-way street. So that's the foundation, is your core belief, that each person can be responsible for their own thoughts and actions. And the parents are guardians and educators in the home about how to be civil, how to be trustworthy, how to pursue goals in ways that will allow you to be secure and be successful. And so with the house rules part, so this is the discipline part. we recommend, and a lot of this was geared around having the devices in the home, because getting regulation over this is a true power struggle for many families. And so what we advocate for is very few rules that foster open communication. So the aim of it is for open communication and less rules, because the more rules you have, the more you have to follow up and enforce. If you don't enforce them, then all of the rules lose their credibility. So fewer rules, the better. And it feels counterintuitive at first. When I work with families, I have a warm-up packet, and they'll go ahead, and I'll say to the moms, usually it's the moms that are bringing me in, but sometimes it's the dads. But they, as a team, what are all the rules that you think you need to have? And so they'll come in with this huge long list. And by the time we're done with our first session, it's like, okay, well, maybe there's only really a handful, because you really, really need to be clear that your aim is to promote transparency, to build trust, and offer a clean slate. And that's the forgiveness part. So if a child is violated a house rule, then the response is, here's the consequence, and I believe in you, and I know you can do better next time. And I often get the question, well, what if they keep doing it again? And so my explanation is, well, it could be a number of things. It could be a stupid rule. I mean, honestly, evaluate, how is this rule serving? And we'll walk through what that looks like. And it could be inappropriate now. Maybe your child's grown or something's changed. And so it's an opportunity when a child is violating, that's an opportunity to learn something about what's going on with the child. And sometimes, because emotion is so strong, we need to involve other professionals. So if anybody is encountering a rebellious streak or something where they don't, understand, connect with me, and we'll figure out if it's something I can help you with, or if you need to see a professional. But I encourage parents to engage professionals and collaborate, because there's a lot of learning that can happen, and it can enrich your relationship. This house rules criteria is also in the Fresh Start Manual. But basically what I encourage parents to do is to think about some of these criteria, so that when you have a few rules, like, for example, unplugging phones at a designated time in the evening, you're going to have maybe some variations on that. Some kids are going to, for age appropriate and school demands, might need to be using a device, but do they need to be using their phone? It really depends on how you're set up, because you want them to be able to do their schoolwork, but at some point the drama needs to end. And so that's the whole point of unplugging at night, is to end the drama, and then begin it again in the morning at the right time. But you want to, of course, you want to have consequences ahead of time. It's not a good thing. Oftentimes I'm with parents, families, I start working with families, and of course, like me, the horse is out of the barn before we try to recover it. And so there are behaviors that they want to recoil back. And depending on how old the kid is, like 16, you need to change your expectations and connect with them in a different way. But the idea is that you have consequences ahead of time. So don't start enforcing consequences midstream. Sit down and talk about what the consequences are going to be moving forward, and how they're serving the child and the family, not just because you said so, because they are very, very worldly. They're very empowered. And they need that sense of connection, like, okay, you get me, I'm a person, I can contribute, and I'm not being outcast. And so the other thing I recommend is a family approved app list. If you have a bigger family, where you list the different apps that are being used. And the whole point of that is to encourage your kids and to say, I'm going to have an open mind. If you want to try this game, or you want to try this social media platform, we're going to learn it together, depending on the age, right? Because as you groom them. And there's something called cyber rites of passage, which we don't have time to go into, but that helps you set a plan for how and when your child gets more autonomy. But at the end of the day, if the whole family has a list of apps based on age and need and benefit, then the idea is that they come and talk to you about, oh, I'm using this app or that app. And then you can do the same. Well, this is the app that I'm using. So it's a collaboration and less of a I'm in control of you type thing, because this is empowerment. This is helping the children be in control of their choices to come to you and work things out, instead of becoming a tool to the device and to the wily ways of some of the nefarious entities out on the internet. This is the process that we use to create house rules. And so we, as I said earlier, we make a list. So you just go for it and you say, these are all the things on my mind. It's sort of like writing down all of the things that are troubling you. So you're marshaling everything that's a concern. And then you review your list and you say, okay, here's the rule that I want. Here's the concern or the interest that it addresses, and then the benefit to the child and to the greater good. I would add a slash to the greater good. Because the idea here is that we're all in this together, to use that cliche term now. If something happens to you, it happens to us. It's that simple. If you're being bullied horribly, if you get caught in a trap, if you're having a horrible anxiety about something you read about the pandemic and COVID and what have you, or friends, we need to know what's happening in your life so that we can help you get through it. And we do this for each other. So that's the spirit that you bring the rules to the forefront. And then this is where I ask parents to be really honest. And you need to kind of assess it from time to time. Are the rules inappropriate, or have the kids grown out of it? What things have changed in your kid's life that maybe you need to change things? And hopefully the kids will be coming to you and saying, yeah, this doesn't work for me anymore. Can we change it? But you want to really eliminate any rules that are really not doing this, serving that higher benefit. And you have to be honest. Is it me wanting to be in control of my child? Because what your job is to teach your child how to be in control and to come to you for guidance so that you can impart wisdom. And then the more wisdom they get with you, the more control they will have over their own heart and mind, and they won't be hijacked online, to use Zelly's term. Love that term, hijacked. These are a couple of examples of rules that empower. So I like this one about mobile devices and, it placed in a recharging location at bedtime. And so you're going to have variations on that, but there just has to be a consensus that, especially when the kids are younger, we need rest, and there needs to be a break. There needs to be a time at which you say to your friends, good night, see you later. I'm closing the door on my house. I'm resting now. And that has to be valued, because there's all kinds of studies on sleep deprivation, and it does create problems, and it doesn't help with anxiety either. And then downloading apps, that this comes back to the pre-approved family app list. And the concern is that if we're not aware of what's happening online, we can't be a resource for you, because if you get caught up in something, the chances are, you might be convinced not to share it. And so we want you never to be in a trap. So we have to have transparency. This is part of the whole transparency thing. And the idea is that, again, if your commitment to yourself and to your child is that you are going to think like a digital native, but only bring your wisdom into it. You have life experience, and be open-minded, and let your child explain, here's the pros and the cons, here's why I want to do this. And then, depending on their age, you can guide them through it, check it out with them, and then have an agreement. Certainly you have to have passwords. And so again, the transparency thing. And for a lot of parents who don't feel tech savvy, if you have any iOS device, I encourage you, well, now you can't go to the Genius Bar because everything's closed down, but you find another young person, a college person, someone in your community that understands how to work the technology to show you how to use parental controls and all that kind of stuff, so that you can feel more comfortable about talking to your child, or maybe even sit down with the three of you. But you have to be open to learning, and it's not about you, being in control of the kid. It's about you learning with your child how to make these devices work to your benefit and not against you. And then I did want to cover this concept. I do a whole nother training on this new relational model of authority. and on the difference between connection and custody, legal custody. And one of the key concepts here is that attention and connection go hand in hand. Undivided attention is so challenging today. And back in the day when, before the smartphone, when I had a position where I was overseeing support operations that had places around the world, and oftentimes I would be working at home, I had given my sons this hand signal. And because for me, I just wanted to make sure that they knew that they had permission to interrupt me. Because again, our kids will make a lot of assumptions without us even telling them, because they're already not feeling worthy. That is sort of our default. Our default is to go away from empowerment. It's to hide and to feel insecure. Oftentimes that can take over. And so when you know, they would come into the room, and you know, if I have my back to the door because I'm on a conference call or something, but these two fingers would come in front. And then they would step back and wait. And you think, well, why are they patiently waiting? You know, they're waiting to tell Johnny's mom that he can come over to spend the night, whatever it is that he had going on. But I would turn, we'd make eye contact, and then he knew that he was gonna give me permission. He gives me permission to wrap up, so that, because he knows he's top priority, but he's giving me permission and respect to wrap up. I should say not permission, respect, to wrap up what I'm talking about. So he could wait patiently, knowing that I'm going to put this person on hold, or I am going to end the conversation. And then when I did put the phone on hold, instead of saying, "What now?" because, you know, you got job pressures, you know, I say, "So what's up? You know, how can I help you?" And it's not that I'm serving him, it's that I am there to be a resource for him, and that it's safe to come and ask me about something that's on his mind. And so then we would address it. And the thing I wanted to make really clear about this is when I implemented this, it was such a relief, because it just seemed like without that permission, anytime you were involved in something, there was a tendency to feel uneasy. And, you know, the kids, it's, you know, that saying, as soon as I get on the phone, everybody's got a question, right? So if you're dealing with that kind of a situation where children are vying for attention, or they're just feeling insecure, give them permission to interrupt. And what I found is when you meet their basic needs to be heard, and to just have, know that they have a path to you, and that they don't have, they matter, that there's a less of a desire to, you know, act out in that way. That's the best way I can describe it now. But it's that sense of, I belong, I know how I can access my parent, because I count on them to take care of my needs, that type of thing. And it's a good habit. It's just a really good habit to teach our kids. And then I just wanted to kind of walk you through some good things to think about and do in the middle of this pandemic. I mean, those are some of the tools that we share in the Fresh Start training about family culture. But these are some of the things that come to mind, and you all may have some really even better ideas. So I'm really welcoming to have your input on that. But I would encourage you to make a list of the things, first of all, that you do admire and appreciate about each child. And because you need to, coming back to my child is magnificent. What's magnificent about my child? Well, they have this kind of personality. They do these kinds of good acts. They have this kind of a heart. They have this talent. They're all unique, and they're all magnificent. So really flood your head and your heart with that knowledge that oftentimes just stays in the subconscious. And we think, don't our kids know how wonderful they are? And sometimes we just need to remind them that we think that they are magnificent. And in texting, there are times when I will just send my sons a reminder. Hey, you know what? I'm just thinking about you. You're my magnificent son. And, you know, I don't always get a response back. It's sometimes I get a heart back, but they get that reinforcement. That's important. Catch your kids doing things right and let them know. It's really, we're prone to harping on the things that aren't right. Create a family schedule and invite your children to submit their own versions of what their schedule needs to look like, and see how their mind's working with it. And also see about getting them to help with household jobs if they don't already have assignments. Again, contributing, they're contributing. Initiate conversations about the things we know and need to discover about the crisis. Verify the facts. Each person could be bringing, you know, you track what's going on in the state, you track with the nation. I mean, there can be a whole collaborative effort about staying informed about the pandemic. Identify your greatest fears and also your greatest hopes, and make time to meditate and give mental energy, your mental energy as the parent, to your hopeful thoughts. In this way, you can retrain your brain to stay in a more empowered state of heart and mind, and to check and hold every thought captive to the hope thought, so that you don't just go into that default mode, less likely to. And so the final stage, I just want to walk you through. Let's see, how are we doing? Oh my gosh, I apologize. It's already 1:28. These are some of the resources. Fresh Start Family Culture. This is the how-to book. A lot of the concepts are in there. It's available on Amazon. Key concepts for crucial conversations are there. Enrichment Resources as another book on the role of a parent in healing a suffering child. A lot of the elements of the relational model of authority are there. I'm available to do coaching. We have a local group here, Recovery Happens, is doing a Zoom group meeting for free for the class of 2020 students that are dealing with the loss and grief and loss of graduation and such things. You'll be getting this as well. There's another young person's virtual 12-step support group for kids that are in recovery of substance use disorder. And then these enrichment exercises are pretty awesome. You have a friend of mine, another colleague, she's offering a month free for the Scholar Within. It's an online reading program. Sammy Circuits, it's a youth motivational speaker and exercise program, very dynamic and a good extra thing to offer kids to do. And another colleague is got a teddy bear that helps kids with anxiety. It's really cool, so check out that. Mind Zen, Zelly, our co-hostess, she's doing, she does stress resilience training and coaching, and she has excellent resources, and she has some free things to offer you if you want to reach out to her directly.